Okay, welcome. Today my topic is misconceptions of imperialism and collective traumas of anarchists. And actually I wrote this text already in mid-March in Finnish. This went for the Kapinotyöläinen paper. I was actually planning to write about completely other things, but then the war came. And also I saw lots of very bad takes, both from different leftists and anarchists. But just to discuss with some of these takes, maybe wouldn't be so interesting, but what was basically my interest and why I wrote this text is to discuss where these ideas actually come from, because obviously there is some sort of backgrounds and some sort of evolution, some historical reasons why people end up to this kind of strange conclusions. So yeah, I saw, and this issue actually hasn't so much changed since the early March. We still see these opinions coming on, maybe even too much discussion. I cannot even follow so much what is happening, but basically, my point is going to kind of meta issues, that where these ideas are basically coming from. And yeah, I saw takes that we shouldn't get engaged to the war. There should not be arms trade to Ukraine, and basically local anarchists and leftists in Ukraine, they should just give up fighting, that they shouldn't defend the governments or nationalism or whatever, but just basically throw away the arms and run away. And yeah, just to discuss these themes, probably it's not possible to convince people, but we could kind of discuss why the leftist and anarchist position is in this kind of pitiful situation. And I don't have real any answers, but I have two sort of working hypotheses. So one is the collective traumas through the historical failures, and other is some pretty bad leftist analysis of imperialism. And of course, besides this, it's also a factor that many anarchists and leftists, they analyze the situation from their own local history and background. For example, anarchists and leftists in Latin America or Balkans, they have some pretty bitter experience with NATO and United States. And it's kind of understandable that they tend to see, like, basically support everything that is against the interest of United States and NATO, because their own personal or their own movements have been more or less facing these issues. But so it's not, I don't see that as that much of a problem. What is, in my opinion, problem are these attempts to create some sort of universal theory which fits in all the possible situations and ends up making some pretty bad conclusions. So, but yeah, before anarchists movement failed in the 20s and 30s and 40s, now anarchists made this kind of statements. And for example, in Finland and Korea, anarchists were part of the movements for the national liberation, and actually quite an important part. And then in many imperial countries like United States or Japan or Great Britain, Netherlands and so on, anarchists made a contribution to support anti-colonialist struggles, even if they were kind of nationalist. And back then it never happened that anarchists would ask some national liberation movement just to lay down their arms and to run away. So what's basically problems with leftist theories of imperialism? So we had to go back to the Leninist definition, which is quite popular in the left. According to Lenin, the imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, and the kind of stage when capitalism starts to collapse from inside. In this theory, the capitalism is always bound to expand, and conquest and periphery, like to conquest all the periphery, and eventually the capitalism will take over, and imperiums will take over the whole world and kind of destroy all this international competition, because together with imperialism also the state capitalism is bound to expand, and eventually by this expansion capitalism kind of destroys itself and becomes just some complete hegemonic monster of control. But this, of course, Leninist rather narrow definition of imperialism is pretty handy for Lenin and the Leninist, because in context of this definition, the Leninist assaults of the Soviet Russia under Lenin against countries like Armenia or Azerbaijan and Georgia and Ukraine, which got basically annexed by the Soviet Union, or Poland, which Soviet Union tried to annex but failed. These were not imperialism, so it's pretty handy to use such a definition of imperialism that your own actions cannot be counted imperialistic, because obviously, like you may argue that the Soviet Union was capitalist, but it was not. The purpose was really not to expand markets of the Soviet Union, but to create unitarian, centralistic worker state. So obviously, these wars and expanding of the Soviet Union in the early 20s, it was not imperialistic in the framework of the Leninist definition. But yeah, and there are also many other examples of imperialism that this Leninist definition is kind of avoiding. And often conquest, it's not motivated by profit seeking. There are many cases and countries are being annexed even if it doesn't make any profit, but for example for us to create buffer zones for some sort of security interests. For example, Finnish conquest of Finland by Alexander I was may not be counted as era of imperialism, or it was maybe the very beginning of the era of imperialism. It was obviously before the industrialization. And the motivation of the annexation of Finland to become part of the Russian Empire, it was a security concerns, because Finland back then, in the beginning of the 19th century, Finland was the poorest country in Europe, and it couldn't really bring that much profit to Russia, more like costs to defending Finland and building and maintaining the fortifications and so on. Finland only became economically strong in the second part of the 19th century, but back then there was no any economic interest. And this was actually quite common factor in the whole history of the Russian Empire. It was just expansion to create security. Many of the peripheric areas, they were not that profitable, and this is also actually one of the logics of the Putin's activities. Yeah, so, and it's also one of the points of the Putin's attack against Ukraine. Obviously there are many reasons which I will handle later, but he also has the idea, Putin has this idea to create sort of satellites, neutral states loyal to Russian interests around Russia. And this war has already been so costly, and it will be so costly if there has to be occupation of some areas of Ukraine and reconstruction. It will cost so much money for the Russian budget that this will not be basically recovered in more than 100 years, for sure, in terms of taxing and so on. So there is not real economist interests on On this attack, it will destroy more capital than it creates. And it was not the Russian capitalists or oligarchs who decided to start this war. It was more or less one person only, and even some Russian capitalists, they were even opposing this war. So to claim that, okay, this is a war started by interest of the capitalists, simply more kind of wishful thinking, trying to fit everything in this world to some box of ideology, which might be something that Lenin could have done, probably not, but definitely not something that Marx would have approached. This kind of, how to say, vulgar Marxism is definitely not something for Marx. And of course you can say that capitalism is in a way behind all the wars in this world, because capitalism is incentivizing competition instead of cooperation. But this mechanism, how this competition between individuals and companies and states eventually is creating conflicts and confrontation between the states up to a war, it's much more complicated than left is about to think. And these attempts of the left to reduce all the wars as plots of capital are often pretty weak, especially when there is no oil, which is about to be in these places which are being attacked, as there is no oil in Ukraine, for example. But even when there is oil, leftists try to think that somehow this still has to do with oil or other natural resources. For example, when NATO was bombing Kosovo in 1991, it was a very common leftist theory that this happens because there are plans to build an oil pipe through Kosovo. But this happened already 23 years ago, but there is still no any oil pipe around there. And also when the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, there was very popular explanation amongst the left that Afghanistan is a very strategic country in terms of oil production, and there will be an oil pipe built through Afghanistan from Central Asia to Indian Ocean, and this is the ultimate reason behind the invasion. But this also never happened. It's still 20 years, almost 20 years as the occupation of Afghanistan lasted, and still there was never even any plans or beginning to construct the oil pipes. But obviously it's these invasions, it was not the point, was also not to bring human rights, but the reasons were starkly ideological. There was not this kind of material motivation, and this ideological motivation between United States and NATO policies in Balkans and Afghanistan, it was to establish some certain kind of imperial order, and also to revenge the humiliations, for example the 9/11 terrorist strikes. And Putin is acting according to similar kind of logics. Besides this goal to establish a security zone, a neutral and loyal buffer state, Putin wants to avenge humiliation, as in the imagination of former KGB agent, the whole collapse of the Soviet Union was some kind of humiliation against his personal ideas and values. And also Putin has this local ultra-nationalistic goals, as vision that all of these Eastern Slavic peoples, they are actually same people, and especially the Russian speakers are the same people, and these territories which have the Russian speaking majority should be basically united under one nation state. For example, parts of Eastern Ukraine, probably some parts of Latvia, Estonia, certainly pretty much all of the Belarus, maybe some parts of Kazakhstan and so on. All of this eventually should be Russian area. Russia should be kind of, if not nation state, it should be a state where the Russian people are so-called titulne nacija, so the kind of nation and language which gives Russian country its identity. So it's kind of shift from this kind of multinational empire ideology to nation state ideology. And there is no point. The goal is obviously not to kill as many people as possible or just to be just evil destruction. But simple Russian army is not very technologically advanced. It doesn't have resources or skills to do precision strikes. So this is why it is simply just making mass carpet artillery attacks against any cities and so on. So there are a huge amount of civilian casualties, but it's obviously not the goal of Putin to kill as many people as possible. And also the same comes to other human rights violations and mass murder and rape. It's just because the Russian army lacks discipline, organization, and simply doesn't care about its operation and popularity and so on. So it's basically just sort of very primitive and brutal operation in spirit of the Red Army of the 40s. So obviously there are some capitalists who are benefiting from this kind of wars and conquest. And whether is the outcome, as long as it's not nuclear war, there are some people making profits. But this still doesn't mean that capitalist is somehow coupled or connected with some superpower. But okay, United States is still the leading capitalist state, but this doesn't mean that the world would be somehow better if some other superpower replaced the United States, or that there would be less capitalism, or if there are like many competing more or less equal superpowers, this so-called multipolar world, which also has been a goal of Putin for some times. It's not necessarily any better than or any less capitalist than the world dominated by the United States. Could be better, but maybe not. And also any other imperialism could basically be just as dangerous as the American imperialism. So like I said, in Greece, Balkan countries, Latin America, there are bitter experiences from American hegemony, United UK hegemony and NATO. And these places, people don't really understand why, for example, Ukraine or even Rojava or what else would ally with Western camp against their enemies. But there are no any universal situation or hierarchies. There are not any solutions which fits all the kinds of situations. And it's not even the case that in the core of all the kinds of oppression would be capitalism, and definitely it's not that the main goal or enemy of each struggle would be the United States. Actually, this kind of putting United States to center of everything, it's pretty typical of American anarchists and leftists, and it's a bit similar kind of approach as this anti-Deutsch leftists have in Germany, that the goal is simply to destroy Germany and everything German, and that would solve all the problems. Obviously, this is not the case. There is new superpowers would simply replace the old ones. And for example, if you are like just example situation that there is people in particular situation facing very heavy oppression which has nothing to do with capitalism. For example, we are familiar with the brutal repression of gay people in parts of Russian Federation in the Northern Caucasus, in the Chechen Republic, ruled by the Kadyrov family. If you are basically uncovered there, if people find out about your orientation, you will be murdered. And this has everything to do with homophobic patriarchy, and it doesn't have anything to do with capitalism, because capitalism can be very much tolerant in some other place. So This war, as I said, it's not like some inevitable consequence of capitalism. Capitalism would have succeeded very well without the war. So also there is no any general rules what is the main enemy or main problem. The most dangerous forms of oppression and worst enemies and potential allies, they are varying depending the time and space. There is no any single solutions which would always fit. So it's not obviously Lenin that is only influential in the left. Also, especially the older generation, people like Chomsky, they are very afraid of the nuclear war, and they analyze his goals is pretty much going around how to minimize the risks of the global annihilations. So Chomsky thinks that the best way to contain Putin is to give some countries as a buffer zone between Russia and the West. But there are some problems with this approach. At first, Chomsky doesn't consider it necessary to ask these people, do they want to be in the Russian satellites in Ukraine or some other countries that basically, according to Chomsky, should be in the Russian buffer zone. And the second problem is that if you give some concessions to dictator, it might be that the dictators will be asking more. Like easy victories and submission, they usually don't stop people who are blinded by their own authority and power. And I wouldn't like to, for example, of course it's a complicated question, like if, for example, Hitler got nuclear bomb, should we kind of tolerate the Holocaust in some limited area or whatever? Hopefully we will never be in this kind of situation. But also, who knows how far Putin will go and what kind of ideas he will be having like 10 years from now or something. So this is why the goal should be somehow to overthrow Putin instead of trying some sort of appeasement to him. But also this overthrowing, there is no way it can be done from abroad. It has to be done by the Russian people. Like, no, you cannot make kind of state intervention to a country which has nuclear weapons. But so, back to the definitions. What should be then a suitable definition of imperialism? Useful definition if we are not interested to use Lenin's definition. So, I would give the following definition of imperialism. Imperialism is pursuit of state to conquest other territories and to reach a status of leading superpower. And this is basically, I was checking some dictionary definitions in Wikipedia and other places for this podcast. And this is basically pretty much what is there in the dictionaries. But I decided not to include this idea of cultural hegemony or economic hegemony, just because it's simply not the same thing. Like, okay, we can say that it's a problem that people don't want to see domestic movies, that there is Hollywood movies and culture everywhere. What about our own language and so on? But this is simply just not the case. It's not comparable. The thing that there is not so much movies in local languages in movie theater, you just cannot compare this to some mass artillery strikes against civilian buildings, for example. It's completely different level of problem. And also this kind of, it's obvious that during last 20 or 30 years or even 50 years, this imperialistic domination has become more and more difficult. Like we see United States failing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most of the former imperialistic countries, They are just, you cannot imagine that Belgium, for example, or Netherlands could be, or Portugal would be able to attack any place, even if they were big colonial empires, like relatively recently. And then this discussion has gone more. We have been discussing lately more issues like economic hegemony or cultural imperialism, but still this would be like sort of inflation of concepts, and this inflation of the concept of imperialism is one of the reasons why left is having often pretty bad analysis on the Ukrainian situation. And I actually see like lots of now discussion on communism and comparisons, and how, for example, Soviet Union had some aspects of colonialism. This is like other topics. I should research this more, but it's my impression that there is also kind of, because of American domination of everything, there is also American domination of academic discussion, and this colonialist studies, post-colonialist framework is just coming from the United States. It's been applied everywhere, and especially, at least, people outside the academia, the journalists and columnists and Twitter commentators, they are applying this framework pretty badly. Because this, I think it's simply not applicable to Eastern Europe. Like, there is certain history of quite recent interethnic violence into Eastern Europe, but I don't think you can put this to colonialist framework. Colonialism, basically, it started from Frantz Fanon's discussion on the otherness, and how are Edward Said's ideology of Orientalism. It's the idea that there are others who are who are exotized, not possible to understand, and also below. Like, there is a class of people who is kind of segregated, but this is not really the situation in the Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, basically, of course, there is a dehumanization. Like, if you are attacking someone, you cannot. If you are like murdering your neighbor, like it often happens during ethnic conflicts, you are not really consider your neighbor as a human being. But still, it's also not other. It's not something non-understandable. Probably you are maybe not talking the same language, but probably you understand each other's language. Probably you eat the same food, you are consuming the same culture. So basically, it's something similar than yourself, just a person with other kind of identity and so on. So not all imperialism is colonialistic. And it's simple just if a smaller country is forming alliance with some sort of superpower against some threats, it's simply not colonialistic. It's not comparable of forcing someone to the sphere of influence, or some country to sphere of influence. And obviously there is still moralistic arguments can be put against different kinds of alliances. You can say that, okay, it's not morally right to join, for example, NATO because of activities of United States against Balkans or Latin America, the former Yugoslavia. But why NATO has been all this time pretty popular in Estonia, for example, it's not because Estonians, they are just want to oppress Kurdish or Palestinians or Iraqis or Serbians in Kosovo or whatever. They just don't want to be conquered by the Russia. And personally, I don't support Finland or any other country to join NATO, but there is no anything like Estonian imperialism. It just doesn't exist. And also, just to pick up some historical examples to go back to, or go further to discussion on inside the anarchist movement. Also, the Spanish Republic tried to get support from the Great Britain and France, and if it got this support, it maybe wouldn't have collapsed. Also, when Kronstadt rebellion and the uprising was obvious that it's going to be crushed, they appealed to Entente countries for support. And on the other hand, all of these colonial movements, or almost all of the anti-colonialistic movements of the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were asking and receiving support from the Soviet Union. And I am not a person, I'm not in the position to condemn any of these people. I'm not someone to condemn Kronstadt sailors or, let us say, ANC for their cooperation, or FLN for their cooperation with the Soviet Union. Like, friend of my friend doesn't necessarily have to be my friend. And to have a bit more recent example, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are moving from poor countries to rich every year. And should we say that these economic migrants, that they are also like some sort of supporters of imperialism because they want to live in imperialistic countries and make their life better? Of course, it might be better that these people were struggling in their own countries against the poverty and oppression there, and not just trying to become citizens of the imperialist countries, because obviously these migrants, they also make imperialistic countries and superpowers more strong. All the population growth in Western countries is due to migration, and often the most skilled and most ambitious people from poor countries, they move to the global north and make the global north even more strong. So should we condemn these migrants, that they are some sort of lackeys of imperialism? I don't think so, and I don't think that we should. I think like it's pretty normal that people try to raise their standard of living. It's wouldn't be useful at all to moralize these people, and it's also basically the reasons why many people in Eastern Europe, they were supporting joining the European Union and NATO. It's just attempts to increase the standard of living and create bigger security. It's not because Eastern Europeans want to go to loot Africa together with the French. So, and also I don't think there is such a thing as Ukrainian imperialism. Yes, there have been lots of conflicts related to national conflicts in Ukraine. It's not only the issue, the position of the Russian language is not only of these internal issues in Ukraine. Also, for example, Ruthenian activists, it's a small nation living in the most western part of Ukraine. They have continuously have problems with Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian secret services. They have been beaten up, sometimes forced to migrate. And in general, in Donbass, it has been also continuously shooting since 2040s. There has been ceasefire violation, obviously, by the Russian-supported separatists, but also by the Ukrainian states. Both sides have been targeting civilian infrastructures and buildings, and there have been civilian deaths from the both sides, which is basically, no matter what you think about this separatist republics and the Russian satellite puppet states, it's still a war crime to shoot their civilians in these areas with artillery. But all of these problems and these issues inside the Ukraine, they have happened inside the borders of 1992. So it's not about conquering other regions. And and it cannot be called imperialism, and even less these conflicts might be called genocide. Otherwise you can basically call any kind of nationalist or nationalist violence and conflicts as genocide, and this would be a total inflation of the concepts. So maybe, I don't know, maybe there would never be this kind of escalations, which obviously was heavily sponsored by Russia and Putin. But maybe it would have been possible to somehow regulate all of these conflicts without going into this level. But it's also not like kind of simple to say that, okay, just give them autonomy or make federalistic Ukraine, or everyone should have a right to separate from countries. For example, like if some country has substantial minority which is super conservative and wants to live in some sort of dictatorship, should they have a right to separate? There is, for example of Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia before the Second World War. Like 88% of them were voting a pro-Nazi party. 40% were even members of this pro-Nazi party. Should these people have a right to separate and to join Nazi Germany? I think it's actually not. I don't have even any easy answer to this. I think it's pretty complicated issue. Like, should people with this kind of ideas, do they have a right of national self-determination? Is ISIS, for example, ISIS was actually pretty popular amongst some clans. So should they have a right to create this kind of theocratic state? It's quite complicated, and now, of course, this is kind of theoretical issues because the scale of destruction that Putin caused, it's completely different compared, and this amount of murder and looting and rape and so on. It's completely different scale than whatever there were problems before 24th of February this year in Ukraine. But it's also possible that after the war, these issues will be back on agenda. And it's even possible that these topics will be on agenda during the war, in case Ukraine gets so much support that it may go to offensive against Crimea, for example. And yeah, it's also true that this kind of, there is now always a clear division between imperialism and nationalism. Obviously, this kind of small nationalism might also be pretty brutal. We have plenty of examples even from history of Finland. In Finland there was a mass murder of the Russian civilians in the last phases of the Finnish Civil War in 1918. Lots of people who were completely neutral or mostly even supporting the White Guards were massacred by the White Guards, and not only Russians, also Polish and Lithuanians and whoever was simply not Finnish. Also, in the continuation war between 1941 and 44, the Finnish army occupied the Eastern Karelia, which never has been part of Finland and Sweden. There were lots of, besides Karelians, there were lots of Russians living in there. They were put to concentration camps. Huge amount of them died. So this is all examples how small countries can also create lots of evil things. But even in this kind of context, you should not never put equality sign between imperialism and nationalism, because nationalism still is often also a force that is destroying imperiums. It's nationalism is used to build imperiums, which is what this Putin attempts to do right now, but nationalism can be also anti-imperialist force. So nothing is simple with the nationalism. It's a complicated force. And this is why everyone who basically makes a statement that they are against every kind of nationalism, it's also a statement against many anti-colonial movements. And whoever is against anti-colonialism movement it's simply in the wrong side of the history. The colonialism is one of the, obviously colonialism is pretty much in the history, but still in many places it's a relatively recent memory, and this kind of tendencies that are very simplistic way making commentary against all the kinds of colonialism. This kind of analysis, it may be popular in places like Moscow or maybe United States, in the central places of former imperiums, but this will never be bought in by the people in the countries who have been quite recently victims of the colonialism. And yeah, back to the discussion of this anarchist collective traumas. I don't think that it's a result of that weakness or a failure of anarchism to become a really broad movement after the Second World War. I don't think it's because I will discuss this more in detail soon, but I don't think it's because anarchists made some very bad strategic or tactical mistakes. But one of the things what might be a real factor is that anarchists failed to give a proper support to anti-colonial movements, and instead of anarchism it was the Soviet Union which was basically providing material support to pretty much all the anti-colonial movements of the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. And this obviously then also spread different Leninist authoritarian concepts all around the world, and caused other kind of destruction, which would have been, maybe could have been avoided if this anti-colonialist movement were more based on anti-authoritarian principles. But yeah, any contribution of anarchists against the liberation, this kind of liberation movements, it would only put anarchist movement backwards in these areas which have been suffering from imperialism and colonialism. So yeah, history of anarchist movement has been full of betrayal and lost opportunities. Leninists betrayed the Russian Revolution. Leninists crushed the free territory of Makhnovshchina. They crushed the Kronstadt uprising. And also in the 30s, the Republican government of Spain, they halted the social revolution in Spain, which was then eventually the republic itself was crushed by the Falang. And also there were lots of hopes that end of the Second World War it would spark new revolutions. Many revolutionaries, anarchists and other revolutionaries, they were joining the resistance movements, but this didn't happen anywhere in the Western Europe, and only in very few places in the East. And also all this anti-colonialist movement, none of them managed to really create any kind of anti-capitalist society. So from this, there has some anarchists, they have made conclusions that anarchists should in general not to fight against fascism or imperialism or colonialism, but and somehow create a theory against all of this. But theory itself has its limitations. You maybe with the right kind of approach and arguments and analysis, you maybe win revolution, but there is no way to win a war with a good theory. Wars are won with material superiority, like whoever has more forces, supplies, troops, allies which can provide material support, they will win the war. Wars, in the beginning of the wars, you basically get your cards, and then during the war you can play the cards. You don't get any new magical artifacts during the war. And anarchists didn't lose in Russia or Spain because anarchists were trying to ally with some non-anarchists, but anarchists lost because the enemies had even more allies. But anarchists somehow have craft some corrections to the ideas and think that if we did something differently, we maybe would have won these wars. For example, many anarchists, they believe that it was mistake of Mahno to make alliance against the Leninists, as if waging war against both the Reds and the Whites, Mahno could have survived longer time. If some anarchists even think that Leninism is some sort of contaminating disease, if you, for example, shake hands with Leninism, you might become a Leninist yourself, and so on. So also some anarchists believe that this alliance of Spanish anarcho-syndicalists and anarchists with the Popular Front government was a mistake. Perhaps, maybe they think that anarchists would have won if they had the war in the same time against both of the Popular Front and Franco. And I think this is not only anti-materialistic theories, but they are just like plain moronic and stupid. Military alliances, they don't really, in the end, have anything to do with ideas. And also, I don't think that Leninism and anarchism are in any ways compatible. Sooner or later, there will be conflict. In the cases of Ukraine in 20s and the Spanish Civil War, Leninists gained the upper hand in these conflicts, but in some other situation, it could be differently. But these alliances with the Bolsheviks, they didn't speed up the defeat of anarchists. Instead, they were postponed. If anarchists didn't form these alliances, they would have been crushed even more early. And this defeat also was kind of predefined. Anarchists simply didn't have any victories or connections to win this war. These resources you should have basically in the beginning of the war. And yes, there is obviously some ethical issues in this discussion of alliances. It doesn't make sense that anarchists should ally with some fraction who is even more dangerous than the enemies. Also, anarchists should not try to whitewash their allies if there are some problems with the allies, and even less so. Anarchists should support the repressive measures made by the anarchist allies. All of this has been done by the anarchists in the past. For example, in the Soviet Russia, in the early years of Soviet Russia, some of the anarchists, they joined the repressions made by the Soviet secret police and supported them. This is obviously something that you shouldn't do. But this is also nowadays no one is really even seriously discussing that should anarchists join the secret police and torture and shoot our enemies. So it's pretty obvious, and also it's a bit underestimation and paternalistic to make this kind of points in the discussion in the movements, that you shouldn't do these things that pretty much everyone agree that you shouldn't do. And there is basically two tendencies which have been very influential on the analysis of the defeat in the Spanish Civil War. One is the Friends of Durruti group. It was kind of opposition inside anarcho-syndicalism during the Spanish Civil War. A couple of years, 1937, 1938, and later in the exile from Spain. And another rather not a group, but a tendency is the Council Communist tendency, which was formed in the Netherlands and Germany in the 30s. And both of these basically are criticizing both Council Communists and both Friends of Durruti group. They are criticizing the Popular Front government of Spain and also the anarcho-syndicalist leadership of CNT-FAI, which joined this Popular Front government. But there is also some big differences between these tendencies. And yes, obviously, the Friends of Durruti group is right that it's not very consistent for anarchists always to criticize government and then in the occasion just basically join the government. So there are also some very based criticism of the Popular Front in Spain. But actually, even if in this ultra-left discussion often it's claimed that Friends of Durruti and the Council Communists, they have basically the same position, this is simply not true. Actually, their positions are diametrically opposite, because in Friends of Durruti, if you read, for example, their pamphlet Towards Fresh Revolution, they are advocating rebellion against the Popular Front government. But they are also not about to give up struggle against the Phalangists, and they are arguing that they should continue the war and put the army under control of the workers. But the Council Communists, for example, the Marx-Lenin Luxembourg Front, which was active in the Netherlands during the Nazi occupation, they were calling the soldiers of the Allies to desert the front, and because according to them, capitalism was equal evil in Great Britain, Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany. And the modern followers of this tendency, they also think that Franco is as bad as Popular Front, anti-fascism is as bad as fascism, and anarchists basically shouldn't have struggled against fascists in Spain or any other place ever. So the position is completely different from the Friends of Durruti. But since then, the Council Communist, it has been quite influential tendency, and they have influenced the French socialism ou barbarie, which from in 40s and 50s, and towards of Castoriadis, and from this basically their ideas spread to the situationist movement, and from the situationism also to many segments of any kind of radical left of these days, and also to anarchism. And in general, I would say that there is a general problem with the revolutionary theory, that it is just growing. Every year there are more and more intellectuals, more and more articles, columns writing, and but the quality is basically not growing with the quantity. And I don't think that you should basically burn these books or commentaries or analyses, that you should trash them. But you should at least like bury them deep in the bottom of the pile, and then maybe once a while just dig this analysis of Ukrainian NATO imperialism or whatever, and just check and see that, okay, this is how low we basically went, and how this is how pitiful was the state of anarchist and left arguments and theory at some point. And you can just simply also survive. You don't need so much analysis or theory to do the things and to struggle. Like, you can learn from the previous generations. They didn't have like so much writing and commentary, and they still somehow managed to do the things and move forward. And as I said before, like before Second World War, no anarchist everywhere made calls to lay down the arms in case of imperialistic attack. But anyway, this was more or less what I had to say today. Again, a bit too much. I was wishing to talk half an hour. I ended up talking almost 1 hour. I had a couple of comments and in the chat, which I could answer at this point, as there are not many. So the problem is not just profits. Okay, first comment is Fort God 3, Nick in the chat. The problem is not just profits, but it is in the essence of technology itself, where Gestel externalize everything. It does not ask, for example, what is the Rhine River or what any river is, but it looks at how much energy can we extract, which isolates the river and transform it into a power source. I'm not basically, this is one example of analysis of idea to somehow build on Marxist ideas and to and to kind of, how to say, expand it to something completely different. And of course, one can say that there is a technology is somehow analogous to capital. The technology has a tendency to expand, but technology can be like very many things, and there are many technologies which have also supported people's power and centralization, like for example gunpowder or Kalashnikov rifle and so on. So I'm not really going to buy kind of primitivist anti-technology analysis of, like, of course there are some points in it and good arguments, but what is the conclusions for activity? Should we basically move back to some sort of Paleolithic age? Like, I'm not going to reject this straightforward. This can be a discussion, but also it's not so easy to kind of expand from the capital. Like, capital is something that clearly has a tendency to accumulate, and it becomes like general power in the society, even if it's moving, like using kind of capital itself cannot do anything. It has to always to have some agents that it's allied with. So there is a certain obvious subjectivity on capital, but is there a subjectivity on very wide and common concept of technology? I don't think this has been conclusively somehow proven. And it's problematic, because if you discuss what are the conclusions from this analysis. Okay, then the second comment also from the fourth god tree. Anarchism is no a coherent philosophy or neither a unified group. When you say anarchists should do this and not that, which group exactly you are referring to? Well, this everyone can decide themselves. I'm only talking about myself, the group I'm involved with, all the groups I have been involved and I will be involved with. They have actively discussion. Everyone has their own position. Hopefully we can more or less agree about stuff. But it's about like, of course one can say it's more interesting questions that if I say discuss about anarchist, that anarchist did this and this mistake, should this be relevant for someone who is non-anarchist? Maybe not. So I can of course discuss in some sort of more general terms that this is like a general human imperative to do this and that, but obviously I think that anarchism is very suitable, kind of has a suitable set of principles for struggle in modern industrial societies, which is pretty much spread all around in the world. So what I say that is should be useful approach for anarchism, it's basically for pretty much any movements in industrial modern societies. So it's kind of, when I talk what anarchists should do, it actually has kind of universal message. But also this discussion is kind of discussion inside the movement, which I try to don't do so often. I try to avoid it, but at this time I basically just had to. I had to. There was so much bad takes, so much bad analysis that I had to engage. I try to talk for a wider audience than just anarchist audience, but this time I made a kind of exception on this. Because obviously there are not so many anarchists. Maybe all the anarchists already have their own opinions. Just I'm in general not super interested to discuss about something inside the anarchist movement. But yeah, whoever, I'm kind of making appeal to whoever is listening. I know that probably even most of the anarchists will never be interested or listen me, but simply I don't care. Like, they will never know that, and they even if I care, they will never know that I would care. So I'm just appealing whoever happens to listen to this, for some reason ended up to listening this. I don't know. It's kind of it's called communication. Like, Are you? Why are we saying things? Why are we writing things? It's a basic kind of human need. It's not something that should be somehow, how to say, based on something. Like, you cannot say that, you cannot go and ask to people, okay, why are you even living in the society? Like, why are you like talking with other people or discussing? Why are you trying to engage? Why are you trying to convince? Most of the people never are convinced about anything we are saying, but this will never stop the attempts of convince people from about whatever stuff. But anyway, okay, no more questions today. Thanks for the audience. I will stop the recording, and also